The morning my nephew showed up at my door with a stranger in a suit. I had just finished my second cup of coffee. I remember that specifically. The second cup. I don't usually have a second cup, but it had been a quiet Tuesday, the kind that makes you slow down without meaning to, and I had stood at the kitchen window watching the cardinals fight over the feeder, the way they always do in November, and I thought, one more cup. Why not? So when the doorbell rang, I wasn't rushed. I wasn't flustered. I set my mug down on the counter, smoothed the front of my cardigan, and walked to the door at my own pace. I know how to read a room, and I knew, before I even opened that door all the way, that this was not a social visit. My name is Vivian. I am 71 years old. I live in the same house in Knoxville, Tennessee, that my husband Lawrence and I bought 33 years ago, when the neighborhood was just starting to turn, and people thought we were foolish to pay what we paid. Lawrence loved proving people wrong. He had a quiet, steady way of being right about things that used to make me laugh, and sometimes still does, even now, 2 years after I buried him. Lawrence was an accountant for 31 years. He retired early 62 because he said life was too short to spend the best hours of your day in a fluorescent office. What he didn't tell most people, because he wasn't the kind of man who talked about money at the dinner table, was that he had spent the last decade of his career quietly, methodically building a wall around everything we had ever worked for. Not a wall anyone could see. That was the point. He put the house in a revocable living trust in 2011. Our investment accounts were structured with transfer-on-death designations naming me as sole beneficiary. He had a separate LLC for the 2 rental properties we owned, a duplex in East Knoxville and a small commercial unit we leased to a dry cleaner on Chapman Highway. I was the only member of that LLC. My name. Only mine. When he sat me down and explained all of this, I was 58 years old, and I remember thinking, Lawrence, this is a lot of paperwork. And he looked at me across the kitchen table with that patient look he had, the one that meant he was not going to argue with me, he was just going to wait. And he said, Vivian, you need to understand this, not for me, for you, after me. I understood it. I made myself understand it. I filed copies of everything in the grey fireproof box in the closet, and I updated our estate attorney's number in my phone, and I did not think about it much after that, because Lawrence was healthy, and we were busy living. And then he wasn't, and we weren't, and I was. The first year after Lawrence died, I moved through my life like I was underwater. Things happened around me. People brought casseroles. My daughter-in-law sent flowers, the expensive kind, from a real florist, not grocery store flowers, and my son called every Sunday. My sister flew in from Phoenix and stayed for 2 weeks and cried more than I did, which struck me as slightly unfair but also deeply human. My nephew, my brother's son, called to check on me. His name is Brett. He's 44, lives about 20 minutes away in Farragut, and has always had a certain energy around him that Lawrence used to describe as a man who's always calculating. Lawrence was not unkind about it, he was just accurate. Brett came by a few times that first year, brought his wife, Courtney. They took me to dinner once at a steakhouse I didn't particularly want to go to, and Brett spent most of the meal asking me thoughtful-sounding questions about how I was managing on my own. Whether the house was too much, whether I'd thought about what the future looked like, I answered pleasantly. I ate my steak. I noticed things. The second year was different. The fog had lifted, not completely, grief doesn't work that way, but enough that I could see clearly again. I had started volunteering twice a week at the public library, shelving books and helping seniors with the computer stations, which sounds modest but gave my weeks a shape I needed. I had lunch with my friend Patricia on Thursdays. I tended my garden. I was not, by any measure, struggling. This seemed to bother Brett in a way he didn't say out loud. The visits became more frequent. Courtney started bringing up, casually, conversationally, the way you bring up something you've been rehearsing, that there were some lovely active adult communities near Farragut. Had I seen the one off Kingston Pike? Gated? A pool? A whole activities calendar? I said it sounded very nice. She mentioned that managing a house alone, at my age, could get to be a lot. The yard. The roof. The what-ifs. I said Lawrence and I had always been good about maintenance. Brett mentioned once that he worried about me rattling around in a big house by myself, that he just wanted to make sure I was protected. That word, protected. I turned it over in my mind after they left that evening. I stood at the sink doing dishes and I thought about Lawrence, about the way he used to say that the most expensive word in the English language is trust, meaning the misplaced kind, meaning be careful who you hand it to. I called our estate attorney the next morning. Her name is Helen. I had known her for 11 years. I just wanted, I told her, to walk through everything again, make sure I understood where things stood. She walked me through it, every piece, the trust, the LLC, the TAOD accounts, everything was exactly where Lawrence had put it. I thanked her. I hung up. I went to the library and shelved an entire cart of large print mysteries and felt, for the first time in a while, like myself. The visit I mentioned at the beginning happened on a Tuesday in November, about 14 months after Lawrence passed. I opened the door, and there was Brett, in a collared shirt, which he doesn't usually wear on a Tuesday. And beside him, a man I had never seen, late 40s, briefcase, the particular expression of someone who is professionally neutral. Aunt Vivian, Brett said, and he smiled the way people smile when they are trying to seem relaxed. This is Gerald. He's a financial advisor. I've been working with him, and I thought it might be helpful if the three of us sat down together, looked at some options. I looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at me. I stepped back from the door. "Come in," I said. "I'll put on some coffee." We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Lawrence had once explained trusts and LLCs to a woman who thought it was a lot of paperwork. I had a clear view of the cardinals from where I sat. Gerald set a folder on the table, and I noticed it had my name on a label on the front tab. My full name, Vivian Louise Hartwell. I let the coffee brew. I did not look at the folder. I asked Gerald where he was from. He said he was based in West Knoxville. I asked how long he'd been in financial advising. He said 16 years. I nodded as if this were very interesting. Brett, across from me, had the look of a man waiting for a presentation to start. A man who has practiced being patient. When the coffee was ready, I poured 3 cups and sat down. Gerald opened the folder. He had a warm voice. Gerald did, the kind designed to put you at ease. He said that Brett had shared some concerns about my situation, that at my stage of life, it was common for people to benefit from a more structured approach to asset management, that there were instruments, he used that word, instruments that could offer me protection and peace of mind. What kind of instruments? I asked. He mentioned a financial power of attorney, broad in scope, he said, comprehensive. It would allow a designated person, he glanced at Brett, to manage financial decisions on my behalf, should I ever be in a position where that was needed. And the assets that would fall under this power of attorney, I said. Could you be more specific about what we're talking about? Gerald looked pleased. This was, I could tell, the part of the conversation he had prepared for. He mentioned the house. checking and savings accounts, any investment or brokerage accounts held in my name. Any property, I said. Yes, he said, any real property. I see, I said. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug. The cardinal at the feeder outside was having an argument with a chickadee, which seemed apt. And what about property held in a trust or through an LLC? Gerald paused. Just a half-second. But I have been reading rooms for 71 years and I do not miss half-seconds. Well, he said, instruments held in trust or structured through an LLC would typically sit outside the scope of a standard power of attorney. Right, I said. I thought so. Brett shifted in his chair. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I had made it strong, the way Lawrence liked it, the way I still make it every morning out of something I can't quite name. Habit, love, stubbornness, probably all three. Brett, I said, and I looked at my nephew directly, the way Lawrence always taught me to look at a person when the conversation matters. I appreciate that you care about me. I want to believe that's true, but I want to be straightforward with you because you're family and I think you deserve that. He opened his mouth. I kept going. The house is in a revocable living trust that Lawrence established in 2011. I am the sole trustee. The rental properties are held through an LLC in my name only. The investment accounts have transfer on death designations that were updated when Lawrence passed. I have an estate attorney I have worked with for over a decade, and I spoke with her recently. I paused. Everything is exactly where it's supposed to be. The kitchen was very quiet. The chickadee had apparently won. The cardinal was gone. Gerald closed his folder. Brett looked at the table for a moment. When he looked up, something had shifted in his face. The practiced ease had gone out of it, and what was left underneath was harder to look at. Not anger, something smaller and sadder than anger. The look of a man who has discovered that the door he was planning to walk through has, somehow, no handle. I was just trying to help, he said. I know, I said, and I meant it, or I meant the part of it that was still worth meaning. But I don't need this kind of help. I stood up. I gathered the coffee cups, the way you do at the end of a visit. Gerald picked up his folder. Brett stood and adjusted his collar. I walked them to the door and I said it was nice to meet Gerald, and I told Brett I'd see him at Thanksgiving. I closed the door. I stood in my front hallway for a moment, just stood there, my hand still on the door handle, and I thought about Lawrence. About a man who retired at 62 because life was too short. About a man who sat at this same kitchen table and said, "For you, Vivian, after me." He had built the wall 14 years ago, quietly, methodically, without fanfare, and today I had just walked up to it and watched someone else walk straight into it. Thanksgiving was fine. Brett was quieter than usual, which Courtney compensated for by talking a great deal about a kitchen renovation they were planning. I brought my sweet potato casserole, the one with the brown sugar and pecans that Lawrence always requested. My son and his family drove up from Chattanooga. The grandchildren were loud and wonderful and knocked over a glass of apple cider, which is exactly what grandchildren are for. Brett and I didn't speak about the kitchen table conversation. We didn't need to. Some things are said, and that's enough. I drove home that evening with the leftover casserole dish in my passenger seat and the radio on, an oldie station, which I know makes me a cliché, but I've reached an age where I have decided that some clichés are clichés because they're true. The heater was running and the highway was mostly empty, and I sang along to a song I half remembered from 1978, and I thought, I am 71 years old, and I live in my own house that belongs to me, fully and legally and completely, in the way that Lawrence intended. I am not rattling around in it, I am living in it. I want to say something to anyone who is listening to this and who is, maybe, where I was 3 years ago, before Lawrence got sick, before the paperwork, before I really sat down and made myself learn what I didn't want to learn, because it meant thinking about a future without the person you've built everything with. It is not morbid to prepare. I know it feels that way. Lawrence had to talk me into it twice before I really listened, but preparation is not giving up on the present. It is not assuming the worst. It is simply deciding, quietly, methodically, without fanfare, that the life you build is worth protecting. Not everyone who asks questions about your finances is trying to take something. Some people genuinely love you and genuinely worry. But love and good intentions are not a substitute for actually knowing where your documents are, who your attorney is, and what your name is on. Those things are yours to know, not anyone else's. Helen, my estate attorney, told me once that the clients who come to her most prepared are always women who were initially terrified of the paperwork. They come in nervous, she said, and then they leave knowing, and knowing is the most powerful thing in this office. I think about that a lot. I also think about the half-second pause. When I asked Gerald about property held in a trust or LLC, and he paused, that half-second told me everything I needed to know about why they had come. A financial advisor who is there to help you doesn't pause at that question. He answers it and moves on. The pause was the tell. Learn to notice the half-second pauses in your life. They're everywhere if you're paying attention. The Cardinals are back this morning. 2 of them, which is unusual. Usually, it's just the one male, very opinionated, very committed to the feeder as his personal property. But today there are 2, and they are not fighting. They are just sitting there in the cold, which is its own kind of thing. I have my coffee, just 1 cup today, I'm back to 1, and I am sitting at the kitchen table where Lawrence once spread out documents and asked me to pay attention, and I am thinking about how much of my life is still here, still mine. The house makes its sounds. The refrigerator hums. The heat kicks on and off. I know exactly what I own. I know exactly where it is. I know exactly who I called when I needed to be sure. That is not a small thing. For a woman at 71 alone in a house in Knoxville in November, that is not a small thing at all. Lawrence knew it. He built the wall so I could live on the right side of it. I am living there. And I am not for a single day taking that for granted. I've thought a lot about what Brett was actually counting on that Tuesday morning, not just the money, though yes, obviously the money, but something beneath that. He was counting on my not knowing. He was counting on the assumption that a 71-year-old widow, still soft from grief, still finding her footing in a house that felt too quiet, would not have done the work. Would not have sat at a kitchen table with a patient man and learned what she didn't want to learn, would not have called her attorney 14 months later, just to be sure. That assumption is what failed him. Not me. Not Lawrence's foresight, though that mattered enormously. The assumption itself, that I was someone who could be managed, that's what walked into my kitchen and left with nothing. I think about cause and effect a lot these days. Maybe more than I used to, not in any mystical sense, just the plain mechanical truth of it. The things we do or don't do accumulate. Lawrence spent a decade quietly building something because he understood that the decisions you make when nothing is wrong are the only ones that truly protect you when everything goes sideways. He didn't wait for a crisis. He didn't assume good faith from everyone who might one day stand between me and what we had built. He just did the work, steadily, without drama, and then he taught me to understand it. That is a kind of intelligence I didn't fully appreciate until I needed it. Real intelligence, I've come to believe, isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about knowing what you don't know and then going and learning it anyway, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it means sitting with paperwork about a future you'd rather not imagine. Lawrence had that. He passed it to me not by telling me what to think, but by sitting across a kitchen table and asking me to pay attention. And I think about Brett, too. I don't say this with satisfaction, or not much anyway. I think about a 44-year-old man who came to his aunt's house with a briefcase and a plan, and I wonder at what point he stopped thinking of me as a person and started thinking of me as a problem to be solved or an asset to be managed. I don't know when that happened. I'm not sure he does either. What I know is that people who treat the elderly as resources to be extracted are not people who've thought carefully about what they themselves are becoming. The world has a way of showing you, eventually, what you have made of yourself. It may not come as dramatically as a folder closed on a kitchen table, but it comes. What I want, if anyone is listening, is for you to take seriously the part of yourself that already knows what you should do. Most of us, if we're honest, know. We know we should understand our own financial situation. We know we should have those hard conversations with an attorney, with a spouse, with ourselves. We put it off because it means thinking about mortality, about absence, about a version of the future that doesn't include someone we love. I understand that avoidance completely. I lived in it for years. But here is what I know now. On the other side of loss, on the other side of a Tuesday morning I will not forget, the work Lawrence did was an act of love, not a legal transaction. Love, the most practical, unglamorous, lasting kind. The kind that says, I will not be here forever, and I refuse to leave you unprotected. That kind of love requires courage and clarity, and the willingness to look at difficult things without flinching. Those are the three things I try to carry with me now, not because anyone told me I should, because I watched one man live them, and I saw what it meant when I needed it most.